the Unsung hero. Very much thank you for coming to this talk. I'm very excited for this. And I want to take a couple steps back. Because I was thinking, well, this is the first talk of the day. How am I going to get this thing kickstarted? And the thing that I thought was funny was, OK, let's assume there's not a Vue language server. How would our development experience would look like? First of all, the good thing is we would still have fancy syntax highlighting. So the thing that most developers care the most about is we would still have that thing. Because the thing is, syntax highlighting in IDEs, at least in text editors like VS Code and stuff, is not much more than a fancy regex. It's actually a pretty fancy regex. So other than that, we would probably still use tools like Prettier, so we would have access to formatting our code, but really not much more. So things like refactoring wouldn't work anymore, auto-completion wouldn't work, auto-imports wouldn't work. Anything TypeScript related wouldn't work. This fancy little pop-up that when you hover over something and it tells you, oh, this is this type and this is the documentation for it, wouldn't work. So I think this gives a little bit of an overview of what the Vue language server does already under the hood for us. And with this talk, what I want to share a little bit is what Volar does, how it's doing things. And I do have some incentive to talk about things like that because I'm developer advocate for JetBrains, so I care a lot about developer tooling. And as Alex already mentioned, I'm RxJS core team, GDE, those kind of things. So thank you very much. Very excited. Volar. The thing that we need to understand a little bit, Volar is not just the engine that powers the Vue language server. It is so much more. You might have seen talks from the Astro people where they are talking about Volar too, because the Astro LSP is also built on top of Volar. And it's not just the Astro LSP, it's also MDX, Amber, Analog, the Angular meter framework, and even parts of, if you're still around for the Angular part of the conference, my second talk on Friday will also mention some of the things that we built for Angular on top of Volar within WebStorm. So Volar is really more of a framework that you can use to build language server and to provide IDE extension. But that still kind of, like it's still kind of weird. OK, what is a language server, right? So like we have those key features, super fancy, right? It sounds super great. Like we have completion, we have TypeScript, we have formatting, we have refactoring, we have auto imports, and all those crazy things. But what is a language server? And it's really pretty simple, actually. The thing is, a language server is always a client-server relationship. In terms of VS Code, this is usually that you have a server that you start as some kind of binary and a plugin that acts as the client. And most of the time, those language servers communicate between, with like standard in, standard out. So it's really not much more than starting a binary and communicating with that open binary, or running binary. One thing that is a little tricky, and I probably get this wrong throughout this talk too, usually when you say LSP, LSP stands for Language Server Protocol. It doesn't make sense to call it LSP because it's really more a server implementation for that protocol. Very commonly, though, you refer to an LSP as that kind of server. Make sense? Yes, thank you. So let's take a look at how this format looks like, right? It's a pretty simple JSON structure where you have an ID, well, it's JSON RPC, so you can have like comments and those kind of things, which is already one of the major critique points with the format because every message needs to have this header here, JSON RPC version 2. You also specify an ID, which is more for the client to track the open request, because it's very asynchronous, so you cannot, if you open a file, there will be like a bazillion requests to the server for like, OK, give me syntax highlighting, give me IntelliSense for the cursor position, and all those things. And with this ID, the client can like decide which response it receives and stuff. As a protocol, there are different methods that we can use. So one of the more common one is the text document completion request, which is if you put in a dot, for instance, you would get like all the properties on a JSON object and those kind of things, right? We're so used to that we don't realize what's happening, but that's the thing that happens under the hood. We also share with the LSP the file so that it can access the related file and the position of the cursor. That is one of the things that is very, very important to understand for LSPs as the way they work. They're very much focused on the current position of the cursor, which also is to some extent a limitation of this protocol as is. Make sense? And then a response would kind of look like this, right? So we have the ID again so that we can track. This is the thing we requested. And then we would get all the completion results to suggest for the user so that they can pick whatever they're looking for. And with that, there's also like, OK, is this a function? Is this a method? Is this a JSON key? Those kind of things. A little bit of documentation. It's very UI-driven from that aspect. So one thing that also is very commonly referred to wrongly is there is a difference between a language server and a language service. I know, super unnecessary. The thing is, a language server is the binary that we're talking about. In the case of Vue.js language server, it's a little binary, you start it, and then it acts as an implementation of that protocol. A language service is the implementation for one specific language. So for instance, Volar provides several language services for CSS, for instance, for HTML, for JSON, for Markdown. And if we're looking at Vue as a language, Vue consists out of HTML, CSS, TypeScript, JSX, if you use it, those kind of things. So the combination of those different services builds a language server. And Volar as a framework also provides much more. This is more for completion. I don't expect you to read all of this. I didn't. So this is kind of how the Vue language server architecture looks like. Pretty much everything that is not Vue specific is directly related to Volar. So Volar provides TypeScript, HTML, CSS support, and the Vue language server then, if we look at a Vue file, for instance, that I have here, right? A .vue file usually consists out of a script part, a template part, and a style part. And that script part is TypeScript, JavaScript, whatever you feel like. That template part is somewhat HTML-ish. It's mostly HTML, except for those parentheses, like the curly braces and those kind of things. And the style is mostly CSS. But then if we look closer at how languages work in the web, we also have those things where we might have CSS in HTML and JavaScript in HTML. So things get really, really tricky really quickly. I already skipped a couple slides, so let's go back real quick. So what the Vue language server does is basically splitting those parts in each file and identifying, OK, this is the TypeScript part, this is the HTML part, and this is the CSS part, and then provide the integration between those two. All the native languages themselves are provided by Volar. The combination of those is implemented in the Vue language server. So what's happening in that case is we need to do some AST parsing. Very fancy word. Who knows what AST is? OK. AST is abstract syntax tree. So it's basically a way how computers look at source code. So you can think of a file as like some kind of tree structure, or it's basically an abstract representation of that file that you can parse and therefore perform operations on, like file edits and those kind of things. It does automatically, the minute you use Volar and the TypeScript servers provide any kind of TypeScript integration, which is so fantastic because TypeScript, or dealing with the TypeScript language server, is a mess. Because who knew here that the TypeScript language server is not an LSP? Yes, I didn't know that either. But the TypeScript language server is close to the LSP implementation, but because those things kind of happened in similar stages of the process, it's not compliant with the LSP specification, which makes integrating the TypeScript language server very, very difficult for tools like NeoVim, for instance, or WebStorm. So we already talked about this, so I'll just skip over this. So this is the core concept of Volar. It's called virtual files. And most language server in our ecosystem, like Ember, Astro, even the Angular language server, work in this concept of virtual files. So you might have a .vue file that gets split up into 3 virtual files, the TypeScript file, the HTML file, and the CSS file. So even though we all like single file components, for the Vue language server, or Volar, under the hood we have 3 files. This allows us to provide integration between them and individually manipulate them. So for instance, right, if you in your HTML part use a different Vue component, you want to import that automatically. That auto import is in the TypeScript part, not in the HTML part. But the reference is in the HTML part. So you need that integration between those different files. And that is really the so important thing for a language server, is to provide this cross-file analysis that you can say, oh, where is this symbol coming from? Where is this component coming from? Let me jump right into this component. It also automatically provides type checking. And that's the reason most people use TypeScript. Volar itself is also very concerned about performance itself. Performance is so difficult to get right because there's so many asynchronous processes going on in a language server. So the thing that Johnson, the core maintainer of Volar, did is he implemented a basic reactivity library that is open source that he uses under the hood to improve performance. Very interesting to check out. And Volar itself is also highly extensible due to that service architecture. Has anyone here heard about the takeover mode kind of thing that happened? Okay. So extensibility is a very interesting point because for Vue to work, you need a TypeScript language server, right? You need TypeScript to work properly. So the first attempt that Volar did was basically to have a Vue language server dealing with all the Vue-related part and use the TypeScript language server. The problem with this approach is that you have 2 language servers allocating memory, might be out of sync with things, and those kind of things. So you have a very weird situation. The second approach, called hybrid mode, was to basically deactivate the TypeScript language server in VS Code and let the Vue language server handle everything TypeScript related. The problem with that is VS Code automatically starts the TypeScript language server. So you had to do some manual steps to deactivate and say that, hey, for Vue-related file, use this language server. So it was kind of a manual process. The last step, and that is the big thing that happened with Volar 2 and the Vue language server 2, is takeover mode. And basically, at this point, you don't see slides anymore. Huh. There we go, easy. So at this point, what the Vue language server did is the TypeScript language server evolved and it allowed for more, or basically enabled a plugin system. So at this point, the Vue language server is a plugin for the TypeScript language server. And this is also how things like Svelte works, for example, where it's really just like telling the TypeScript language server now, okay, also consider Vue files, and here's how you handle those Vue files. But your TypeScript parts, you still deal with those. The benefit of that is that you now just have one language server, therefore not redundant memory allocation and those kind of things. So the extensibility part from like a framework design is very, very important. Because if there's now like, let's say like a Vue meta framework, they could just register as another plugin to the Vue language server and therefore provide like additional capabilities and stuff. One thing I would like you to check out is Volar Labs. It helped me a lot understanding what's going on. And even if you're just like having like 20 minutes, drinking some coffee, just install that plugin in VS Code and maybe close VS Code afterwards, but different conversation. You will very clearly see how Volar looks at the virtual files. What are the plugins that you use for these files? How does the original Vue file map to the TypeScript part and those things? Very, very interesting. Can just recommend checking this out. And now the thing that I'm a little bit more excited to share is how WebStorm handles the Vue language server. Because with the more recent version, we're using the Vue language server under the hood. So we're still benefiting from all the amazing features and the performance that Johnson and the whole team is working on. But the thing that we then do is enrich it with because at the end of the day, we still do our own lexicon parser for Vue files. So we can, on top of that, build an internal model, considering out of the parts that we receive from the language server and our own models that we have for our own languages and things like that, and then add IDE-specific features on top of that that might not be part of the LSP protocol. That's like HTTP, whatever. For instance, the LSP specification doesn't have anything for testing, right? Most JavaScript frameworks these days come with some kind of testing capacity. So you might want to generate like coverage reports. You might want to execute tests for single view components and those kind of things. LSPs as is cannot support that. VS Code has plugin APIs that you can write your own plugin to provide VTest support or those things. But the Vue language server, as things are right now, won't be able to provide support for debugging testing. Therefore, having this wrapped in our own plugin allows us to use or benefit from the innovation in the Vue language server, but also provide features on top to provide you as a user a great out-of-the-box experience. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, what direction is Volar going? The big thing is, because it's in your IDE, we're typing pretty fast. We have AI capabilities, right? So we are like writing code. So the language server needs to be fast. It's the worst if you get results for something that you've typed earlier and it's already invalid. Everyone has seen that with TypeScript happen before, where you're like already 3 keystrokes ahead, but you receive old suggestions. So having cancellation support and a fast LSP is critical to provide a good user experience. There's also more integrations going on that the Volar team is working on, for instance, for YAML, for Code Mirror, which is like an online IDE kind of thing. Svelte is considering using Volar for the Svelte language server. So there are a lot of interesting things going on in that direction. There is, I mean, it wouldn't be 2024 if we wouldn't talk about AI. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. Am I? Well, we'll see. But the thing that I think is the most interesting about Volar is you can literally build anything you want with it. Like, as long as we're talking about developer tooling, everything that is in your imagination, you can build yourself. And this is a perfect transition to, OK, why did we now listen for 20 minutes for something that is already built into my code editor and doesn't really affect me directly? Who had that thought? I had that thought working on those slides. You're an honest man. So the thing that I wanted from this talk is, and this quote from Galileo really describes it well, besides that it's maybe like unnecessarily generating for 2024. But the thing that is really interesting from a talk perspective like this is I could show you code examples for Volar. I can teach you this is how you write your own language service. This is how you write your own LSP with Volar. At the end of the day, you might not do that. So you're not going to take a whole lot of things out of this talk. What I want to do with this talk particular is inspire you and share my passion for developer tooling with you. So I hope that you realize, OK, this thing is kind of interesting. There's a lot of things going on under the hood. And I really rather, or instead of showing you some fancy Volar code, want to inspire you to be like, OK, maybe I should check what's going on under the hood. Maybe I should spend some time and understand how the tools that I use on a daily basis for 8 hours, maybe more, hopefully less, how those tools work, because it's really interesting. And it helps us understand better or get more empathy for the maintainers like that. And Volar is definitely underfunded, so they appreciate any kind of support they can get. And it's a highly complex domain, so if you, to some extent, even just to the slightest, feel like, I should spend some time and look into Volar, I know that the maintainer and the team behind it will appreciate it a lot, and I would appreciate it, because I think it's interesting, and I hope that I could share that interest with you to some extent. And this is my talk. I didn't want to spend like the whole 30 minutes, because it's the first talk. I'm under-caffeinated. Very likely you are under-caffeinated. So if you have any questions about Volar, Vue, Angular, RxJS, WebStorm, whatever, I'll be running around here. The link to the slides is on that QR code. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.